Every hooded eye tells a story its owner has never heard. Geneticists, sequencing ancient bones, found a pattern buried in the DNA, a pattern that survived famine, migration, and 40,000 years of evolution to end up exactly where it is today, folded quietly into your eyelid. This is the science that finally explains where that fold really came from and why it never should have survived this long. And once you understand what is actually happening beneath the surface of the skin, you will never look at a photograph of your own face the same way again. Start with the shape itself, because most people who have hooded eyes have never actually had the anatomy explained to them in plain language. A hooded eye is defined by a fold of skin that begins near the brow bone and drapes downward, settling over the natural crease of the upper eyelid. When the eye is fully open, that crease, the line that would normally be visible just above the lash, line disappears beneath the overhanging skin. The effect is subtle in some faces and dramatic in others, but the underlying structure is the same everywhere it appears. Instead of the eyelid showing a clean band of skin between the lashes and the fold itself becomes the dominant feature, concealing the machinery underneath and giving the eyes a lowered, heavy-lidded appearance, even when the person is wide awake and fully alert. It is one of the most common eyelid configurations in the world, and it exists on every continent, in every population, cutting across the lines people usually draw between ethnic groups. That last point matters, because hooded eyes are frequently confused with two other features that look similar on camera but come from entirely different biological causes. The first is ptosis, a drooping of the eyelid caused by weakness in the muscle that lifts it, which is a functional issue rather than a structural one, and can sometimes signal an underlying nerve or muscle condition. The second is the epicanthic fold, a small tuck of skin at the inner corner of the eye, near the tear duct, which is a separate anatomical feature entirely, and is not the same thing as hooding, even though the two frequently appear together in the same face and get lumped together in casual conversation. A hooded eye can exist with or without an epicanthic fold. An epicanthic fold can exist with or without hooding. A person can also have ptosis layered on top of either or both, further complicating how a given face reads at a glance, which is exactly why clinicians examining eyelid structure professionally rely on precise measurements rather than a single visual impression. Conflating all of these features has caused a lot of confusion in both popular science writing and in the comment sections of videos exactly like this one, so getting the distinction right from the start changes how the rest of the story makes sense. Once the anatomy is settled, the harder and more interesting question begins, which is why this particular fold of skin exists at all, and why some people are born with it while others develop it decades later, and why it shows up so unevenly across human populations. The starting point for any real answer is genetics, and the first thing serious researchers will tell you is that there's no single gene responsible for hooded eyes. There is no switch that flips on or off. Eyelid structure is what geneticists call a polygenic trait, meaning it emerges from the combined layered influence of many different genes working together, each one nudging the outcome slightly in one direction or another. Some of those genes influence how much collagen the skin produces. Others shape the underlying bone structure of the brow and orbit. Still others control how fat is distributed around the eye socket, which matters enormously because fat pads under the skin are a major part of what gives an eyelid its shape and its degree of fold. No single gene decides the outcome on its own. The final shape of any individual's eyelid is the sum of dozens of small genetic contributions layered on top of each other, which is exactly why siblings from the same two parents can end up with visibly different eye shapes, and why the degree of hooding can vary so widely, even within one extended family tree. Before going further into the genetics, it is worth sitting for a moment with why a fold of skin above the eye has become such a persistent subject of fascination, confusion, and even cosmetic industry marketing in the first place. Eyelid shape is one of the first things the human brain registers when reading a face, tied up closely with how alert, tired, warm, or approachable a person appears to be, purely as a matter of visual geometry rather than any actual reflection of personality or energy level. That perceptual weight is part of why an entire branch of cosmetic surgery, blepharoplasty, exists specifically to reshape the upper eyelid, and why makeup tutorials devoted to hooded eyes routinely rank among the most searched beauty content online. None of that cultural attention explains the biology, but it explains why so many people eventually go looking for an actual scientific answer instead of settling for guesswork, and why a topic this specific keeps resurfacing in genetics, reporting decade after decade. The evidence for a strong genetic component comes from more than just casual observation of family resemblance. Twin studies, which compare identical twins who share essentially all of their DNA against fraternal twins who share only about half, consistently show that identical twins have far more similar eye shapes than fraternal twins do. That gap is one of the clearest available signals that a trait is substantially inherited rather than determined by environment or chance, because identical twins raised in different households, eating different diets and living different lives, still end up with remarkably matched eyelid structure, while fraternal twins raised side by side in the same household diverge much more. Genome-wide association studies, the large-scale genetic surveys that scan the entire genome across thousands of people looking for statistical links between specific DNA variants and physical traits, have pushed this further by identifying multiple distinct locations on the genome that correlate with eye morphology. These studies do not point to one culprit gene sitting alone in the genome. They point to a scattered constellation of loci, some tied to collagen production, some tied to skin thickness, some tied to the broader architecture of craniofacial development, all of them contributing small, additive effects that stack together into the final visible shape of an eye. It helps to understand a little more about what those genome-wide association studies are actually doing, because the term gets thrown around loosely in popular science coverage without much explanation of the method behind it. Researchers take a large sample of people, often tens of thousands, sequence relevant portions of their genomes, and then photograph or measure a specific physical trait, in this case the geometry of the eyelid, across the entire group. Statistical software then scans the genome for variants that show up more often in people with one version of the trait than another, flagging any location where the correlation is too strong to be explained by chance alone. The strength of this method is scale. A single family pedigree can suggest a trait runs in the bloodline, but it cannot separate coincidence from causation the way a study spanning tens of thousands of unrelated genomes can. The weakness is that correlation identified this way does not automatically prove that a flagged gene directly causes the trait, only that it travels alongside it often enough to be statistically significant, which is why researchers describe these loci as associated with eye morphology rather than confirmed causes of it. A distinction that matters enormously when translating a technical paper into a documentary script without overstating the certainty of the science. Of everything researchers have identified so far, one gene comes up again and again in discussions of eye shape and eyelid structure specifically, and that gene is EDR, short for the ectodisplacin A receptor. EDR is not a minor footnote in this story. It is one of the most heavily studied genes in modern human population genetics, largely because of a single variant known as EDR-V372A, a mutation that arose at some point in the deep past and then spread through certain human populations at a speed that immediately caught the attention of geneticists studying natural selection. When a genetic variant becomes unusually common in a population far faster than random chance would predict, that pattern is a signature of positive selection, meaning the variant conferred some kind of survival or reproductive advantage significant enough that carriers of the gene systematically out-reproduced everyone around them. EDR-V370A shows exactly that signature, and it has been linked to a cluster of traits that go well beyond eye shape, including thicker hair shafts, a higher density of sweat glands across the body, changes in tooth shape, and possibly, though this piece is still being actively researched, aspects of eyelid formation itself. The direct causal link between EAR and hooded or single eyelid structure specifically has not been fully nailed down the way the hair and sweat gland connections have, but the population genetics data shows a strong statistical correlation. Strong enough that most researchers working in this space treat EDR as one of the leading genetic threads tying together this entire cluster of physical features. EDR itself was not originally discovered through eyelid research at all. Its function first drew scientific attention through a rare inherited condition called hypohidrotic ectodermal dysplasia, in which mutations affecting the ectodisplacin signaling pathway disrupt the normal development of hair, teeth, and sweat glands, sometimes severely, enough to affect an individual's ability to regulate body temperature through sweating. That original medical research established EDAR as a master regulatory gene sitting near the top of a signaling cascade that shapes multiple skin-derived structures at once during embryonic development, which is precisely why a single common variant of the gene has been able to influence such a wide and seemingly unrelated bundle of traits simultaneously: hair thickness, sweat gland density, tooth shape, and potentially eyelid architecture, rather than affecting just one isolated feature. Once population geneticists realized that the same gene sitting at the center of that rare disorder also had a common variant spreading rapidly through East Asian populations, the story shifted from a narrow medical curiosity into one of the more prominent case studies in modern human evolutionary genetics, cited constantly in academic literature on recent positive selection in our species. The timing of that mutation is where the story turns from biology into deep history. Genetic dating techniques, which estimate how long ago a particular variant arose based on patterns of genetic diversity around it, place the rise of the EDAR V370A variant at somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 years ago, a period that lines up closely with a stretch of serious climatic stress during the last ice age. At that point in human history, populations that would eventually become the ancestors of modern East Asian groups were living through, and in many cases migrating through, some of the harshest environments our species has ever occupied, pushing into higher latitudes across Siberia and the edges of the Asian steppe, where winters were long, sunlight reflecting off snow and ice was intense, and every physiological advantage against cold and glare would have mattered for survival. It is inside that specific historical window, harsh, cold, blinding light, and constant northward pressure, that the leading adaptive theory for hooded and heavily lidded eyes takes shape. The core version of that theory goes like this: a thicker fold of skin over the eye, supported by an extra layer of fat distributed around the orbit, would have provided a measurable physical advantage in an environment defined by extreme cold and relentless glare. Fat is a poor conductor of heat, which makes it an efficient insulator, and distributing more of it around the eye socket and eyelid would have helped protect one of the most heat-sensitive and exposed parts of the human face from frostbite and cold injury during long exposure to sub-zero temperatures. At the same time, a narrower effective opening created by the overhanging fold would have functioned as a kind of built-in filter against the blinding reflected light coming off endless fields of snow and ice, a natural analog to the carved snow goggles that Arctic peoples independently invented much later to solve the exact same problem of glare-induced snow blindness. Under this framework, the fold is not incidental. It is functional architecture, shaped over generations by the brutal selective pressure of an ice age environment, preserved and spread precisely because it gave carriers a real, measurable edge in staying alive and healthy long enough to survive brutal winters and reproduce successfully. It is a compelling story, and it is the version that shows up most often in popular science writing about this topic. But a responsible account of the current research has to include the evidence that complicates it, because the cold adaptation explanation runs into a genuine problem when you look at where else this fold appears in the modern human population. The Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, indigenous to a region with no history of ice age glaciation, snowfields, or sustained sub-zero winters, also show variations of this same eyelid structure. If the fold were purely and exclusively a product of cold and glare adaptation in ice age Siberia, its presence in a population with an entirely different climatics, history, and a completely separate evolutionary lineage becomes very difficult to explain through that mechanism alone. This is exactly the kind of inconvenient data point that gets left out of simplified viral explanations, and it is exactly the kind of data point that a serious documentary treatment of this topic has to sit with honestly, rather than smoothing over for the sake of a tidier narrative. The Khoisan case is not a minor footnote either. The Khoisan peoples represent one of the oldest and most genetically distinct lineages in the entire human family tree, with a population history that diverged from the ancestors of most other living humans tens of thousands of years, before the EDAR variant is estimated to have even appeared in Siberia. Their branch of the human story never passed through the ice age bottleneck of high-latitude Eurasia at all, which means whatever produced hooded or heavily lidded eye shapes within their population almost certainly arose through a separate genetic mechanism entirely, unconnected to EDAR and unconnected to the specific cold and glare selection pressure researchers point to when explaining the East Asian pattern. Rather than undermining the overall genetics of eyelid structure, this actually reinforces the central point that the trait is not owned by any single evolutionary event. It is a visual outcome that multiple, entirely separate genetic pathways across the human species have independently arrived at, a phenomenon evolutionary biologists call convergent evolution when it happens between different species, and something closely related to it happening here within our own. That complication does not mean the cold adaptation theory is wrong. It means the story is not finished, and it opens the door to the other mechanisms population geneticists take seriously alongside natural selection. One of those mechanisms is genetic drift, the process by which a trait can become common in a population simply through random chance rather than any selective advantage at all, especially in smaller founding populations, where a handful of individuals carrying a particular variant can end up disproportionately represented in all of their descendants purely by statistical luck. Small groups splitting off to colonize new territory are especially vulnerable to this effect, sometimes called a founder effect, where the genetic makeup of an entire future population gets skewed early on by whichever traits happen to be present in the small number of people who made the journey first. Another mechanism worth taking seriously is sexual selection, the idea that a physical trait can spread through a population, not because it improves survival in a harsh climate, but because it became, for cultural or aesthetic reasons within a given group, associated with attractiveness or desirability, giving carriers of the trait a reproductive edge that has nothing to do with cold or glare at all. Under this view, different populations carrying similar-looking eyelid structures might not share one single unified explanation. Some instances could be the product of climate-driven selection, some could be the product of drift inside a small founding population, and some could be the product of mate preference operating independently in a completely different part of the world, all converging on a visually similar outcome through entirely different evolutionary paths. Evolution is not always a single clean story with one cause and one effect. Sometimes it is several different stories that happen to end up looking the same on the surface. There is another layer worth mentioning before moving away from the genetics entirely, and that is epigenetics, the study of how gene expression can be turned up or down by environmental and developmental factors without any change to the underlying DNA sequence itself. Nutrition during early development, hormonal exposure in the womb, and even conditions during adolescence can all influence how strongly a person's inherited genetic tendencies toward a particular eyelid shape actually express themselves in the final adult face. Two people carrying an identical set of eyelid-related gene variants could still end up with visibly different degrees of hooding if their early development diverged in ways that affected collagen production, fat distribution, or skin thickness during the growth years, or even later in adulthood through factors like sun exposure, smoking, and general skin health, all of which interact with the genetic baseline rather than operating separately from it. This is part of why geneticists are careful to describe inherited traits like eyelid shape as a probability shaped by DNA rather than a fixed outcome guaranteed by it, since genes set the range of possible outcomes, while a whole separate layer of biology decides where within that range any individual actually lands. There's also a second, entirely separate track running alongside all of this genetic history, and it has nothing to do with ancient migration or ice age selection pressure at all. Hooded eyes are not always present from birth. A significant number of people develop them later in life, sometimes not appearing until well into adulthood, through a process called dermatochalasis, in which the skin of the upper eyelid gradually loses collagen and elastin over the years and begins to sag under the simple, unglamorous pull of gravity. This age-related version of hooding is mechanically similar in appearance to the inherited version, in that both involve excess skin settling over the eyelid crease, but the underlying cause is completely different, one rooted in a genetic story tens of thousands of years old, and the other rooted in the ordinary biology of aging skin. Distinguishing between the two matters clinically as well as historically, because acquired hooding tied to aging can, in more severe cases, begin to interfere with peripheral vision as the drooping skin encroaches further on the visual field, which is a medical consideration entirely separate from the evolutionary question of where the trait originated in populations that carry it from birth. A person can, in principle, be born with a naturally hooded eye shape and then experience additional age-related hooding layered on top of it decades later, which is part of why the degree of hooding in any one individual's face can shift noticeably as they move from their 20s into their 50s and beyond. The migration story itself deserves a little more texture than a single mention of Siberia, because the population that carried the EDAR variant did not simply arrive in East Asia and stop moving. Descendants of those same Ice Age populations eventually pushed further east and north, crossing the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska during periods of lowered sea level, carrying their genetic inheritance with them into a completely new continent. That single migration event is why researchers studying the genetics of indigenous peoples across the Americas frequently find traces of the same EDAR variant and related traits that show up in East Asian populations today, a genetic thread connecting communities separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years of independent history, all tracing back to the same small founding population that endured the same brutal ice age conditions before, splitting apart and moving in different directions across two continents. Eye shape is only one small piece of that shared inheritance, but it is a visible one, and it is part of why researchers treat eyelid morphology as one thread among several, alongside blood type distributions, dental patterns, and other markers, when reconstructing the deep migration routes that populated the Americas thousands of years before any written record of the journey existed. Zooming back out to the population level, the geographic distribution of this trait today reflects the long, layered history behind it, rather than any single clean pattern. It appears at high frequency across East Asian populations, consistent with the EDAR variant's rise and spread in that lineage during the period of Ice Age migration through Siberia. It also appears, in different combinations and to different degrees, in populations across other parts of the world, including groups with no direct genetic connection to that specific East Asian lineage, which is consistent with the idea that multiple independent evolutionary pathways, selection in one place, drift in another, mate preference in a third, converged on broadly similar physical outcomes. None of this makes eye shape a reliable marker of ancestry on its own, and researchers are consistently cautious about that point because a polygenic trait shaped by multiple overlapping mechanisms across different populations cannot be treated as a simple genetic fingerprint, the way something like a single, well-characterized disease mutation sometimes can. What the distribution does show is a visible trace of deep human history written into a feature most people never think twice about. A reminder that the face in the mirror is carrying information that predates written language, predates agriculture, predates almost every marker of civilization. People usually associate with the concept of history. All of this has practical relevance now in a way it did not have even a decade ago, because consumer DNA testing has put raw genetic data into the hands of millions of ordinary people who are increasingly curious about what their own results actually mean beyond broad ancestry percentages. Someone who receives a report flagging the EDR variant or cluster of eye morphology-associated markers is essentially holding a small fragment of the exact research described here, translated into a consumer-facing format. The catch is that most of these commercial reports simplify the science considerably, often presenting a single flagged variant as though it were a definitive explanation for a visible trait, when the underlying academic research almost always describes something closer to a probabilistic contribution buried inside a much larger polygenic picture involving dozens of other loci the consumer report never mentions. Understanding the difference between a scientifically rigorous explanation and a marketing-friendly simplification of that explanation is increasingly relevant as more people encounter this kind of information directly, without a geneticist standing next to them to provide the necessary caveats. What makes this particular story worth telling is not just the genetics itself, interesting as it is, but what it reveals about how much unexamined history sits inside completely ordinary features of the human body. Nobody looks in the mirror in the morning and consciously registers the fold above their eye as a fragment of Ice Age survival biology, a signature of ancient migration routes across frozen terrain, or a case study in the mechanics of natural selection. It simply looks like a face. But underneath that ordinary appearance is a genuinely deep and still partially unresolved scientific story, one involving multiple genes acting in concert, at least one heavily studied variant with a documented evolutionary timeline stretching back tens of thousands of years, competing theories that scientists have not fully reconciled with each other, and a stubborn piece of counter-evidence in southern Africa that keeps the simplest version of the story from being the whole truth. That mixture of certainty and open question is, in the end, a fairly accurate summary of where a lot of human genetics research currently stands. Some things are well established. The polygenic nature of eye shape is well established. The strong role of heredity, confirmed repeatedly through twin studies, is well established. The existence and approximate age of the EDR variant is well established. But the full causal chain connecting climate, migration, selection, drift, and preference into one complete explanation for why any single person's eyes look the way they do is still being actively worked out. One study, one genome, one population comparison at a time. So the next time you notice that fold above your own eyes, or above the eyes of someone sitting across the table from you, there is a fair chance you are looking at something considerably older than either of you realized, a physical trace of a mutation that first appeared somewhere in the deep cold of the last ice age, carried forward silently across tens of thousands of years and thousands upon thousands of generations, surviving famine and migration and everything else the intervening history of the human species could throw at it, to end up, quietly and without ceremony, folded into the shape of an eyelid. It did not have to survive this long. Most genetic variants do not. The overwhelming majority of mutations that ever appeared in the human genome vanished within a handful of generations, lost to chance, to environmental pressure, or simply to the ordinary churn of reproduction, leaving no visible trace on any living descendant. This one did survive, against those odds, spreading widely enough and reliably enough that it now shows up on the faces of a meaningful fraction of the entire human species, and it is now written into your face or into the face of someone you love, whether or not you ever knew the story behind it until this very moment. That is the quiet. Strangeness sitting inside an entirely ordinary feature most people never think to question. A reminder that the body itself is a kind of archive, holding onto fragments of a history far older and far colder than anything written down in any book, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right question and go looking for the answer folded into the skin.